listen-only mode.
Hello everyone. Welcome to the IJET webinar, Security, Terrorism, and Unrest, Drivers for Risk Management Competencies. My name is Erica Sante and I will be moderating this webinar. I'm joined today by my co-organizer, Rosalind Poole, who will be moderating the webinar chat feature behind the scenes. Our guest speaker today is Michael Payne, Manager Organizational Resilience here at IJET International. And before we dive in with Mike, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. Today's webinar will be recorded and available on ijet.com following the presentation. In addition, we will email a direct link to this recording to all participants here today in the event that you would like to refer back to the presentation or share it with your colleagues. Please note, audio for all attendees has been muted. If you have any questions as we move through the webinar, please use the chat feature in the GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. My co-organizer, Roz, will answer shorter questions and field any tech setup questions throughout this webinar. We will also provide the opportunity for Mike to answer your questions live for the group in the last few minutes of this webinar. When you log off of today's webinar, a brief survey will appear. We encourage everyone to take the survey and let us know how we did today and provide recommendations for future events. Please note that Mike has provided sample risk register and SWOT analysis takeaways for today's discussion. These items are located in the handouts section of your GoToWebinar control panel. With that, I would like to introduce our presenter today, Michael Payne. Mike leads IJET's Organizational Resilience Department within the Global Operations Division and is responsible for organizational planning, readiness, security operations, strategy, assessments, evaluations, resiliency, system design, and emergency assistance. Mike has a distinguished career managing the operations, crisis, emergency response, protective strategies, physical security implementation, physical and cyber security integration, procedural development, and personal situational awareness and safety for several critical infrastructure and key resource entities. He is also an ASIS International Certified Protection Professional and DRI International Certified Business Continuity Planner, as well as a 2005 Risk and Insurance Risk All-Stars Award winner. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, Erica. Thank you.
I am now going to transfer controls to you so that you can share your screen and take us through our presentation today.
Great, thank you. Navigating today's environment can be difficult. In light of increasing global chaos, ever-changing regulatory requirements, and tumultuous operating environments, there's no shortage of challenges to be addressed. Many are experiencing uncertainty as they struggle to develop a strategic view of risk and the measures needed to address it. Why? Well, this condition can originate in one or more of three major areas: oversight and leveraging risk management competencies, understanding and managing risk appetite, tolerance, and capacity, policies and plans ongoing applicability via maintenance, training, and exercise. While these shortfalls increase our risk profile, there is a success path. This webinar focuses on three key approaches which, if adequately applied, allow an entity to establish or regain a level of certainty. And these are risk management competencies to improve capabilities and effectiveness, status and circumstances which should be driving planning and response efforts, as well as precepts and decision-making tools. Given this information, what are the current perceptions of leadership? In analyzing several recent surveys, this chart represents a consolidated leadership perception of risk and security and the primary source causing struggles. And looking at these percentages, it appears this might be why a majority of leadership is struggling to find balance. Risk and security are the capabilities needed to mitigate loss and disruption. When applied effectively, they facilitate sustainment and growth. So what could be the origin to these perceptions? My apologies. So although the slide has been distorted here, the major time and effort burden is at approximately 30%, and that's the possibility of confusing action with progress. And then there's 28% that have capability shortages. This could be limited focus on dedicated training and professional development programs, as well as capturing relevant aspects in a job description. And then there's 26% cost constraints. And the question here is, are resources applied supported by risk and impact assessments, exercise results, and audit findings? As we can see, organization effectiveness, 1 in 10 view their organization as effective. It is likely they ensure their strategy sessions align with foundational disciplines. But for others, as Mark McNeely points out in Sun Tzu in The Art of Business, their meetings flounder with no agenda, methods, or data to support decision making. This leads to various tangents which accomplish nothing but frustration and misguided perceptions. So what are these risk management competencies? This graphic is derived from a more sophisticated model developed by the Risk and Insurance Management Society, also known as RMCs. It's a dynamic model of 3 major skill sets. Note that one of the 5 bolded attributes stands out beyond the others. Vigilance, that is carefully monitoring for opportunities and signs of danger, is specifically called out due to the importance of establishing key indicators and monitoring shifts in the risk profile of your assets. When addressing other bolded attributes, the entity should establish appropriate event triggers to define when, how, and who to escalate the condition to in support of life safety and priority adjustments. Capturing the appropriate competencies aids to ensure the entity sustains the necessary attributes. The question now is how to convince leaders to embrace risk management competencies, or RMCs. Because every entity has a different risk profile, even when in the same industry or location, one way, and likely the most effective way, is to state the value of RMCs is inverse to the probability of failure. This is depicted in the equation on the slide. So what actions should be considered to drive the organization? Most organizations establish some form of preparedness, but others take it to the next level by formalizing training, exercises, and audits to limit unforecasted impacts. These proactive steps allow us to determine our level of effectiveness as it relates to response in crisis. A mature entity would place the outcomes into the continuous improvement process, driving corrective actions to achieve the desired level of risk acceptance. However, upon disruption, the entity could find these are ineffective, as the plan's designs and priorities were based on assumptions rather than analysis. Uncertainty can originate from oversight in 2 critical processes: underestimating the need for training, audits, and exercises to measure effectiveness, and overlooking preemptive actions to support the proactive efforts. So as we can see on the bottom of the slide, there's no foundation to build the designs, plans, and priorities on. For organizations achieving the level of maturity shown here on the slide now in totality, shortfalls can originate from unassigned owners to maintain and monitor these gains. Unfortunately, these are usually found through post-event analysis where substantial life, fiscal, brand, and reputational losses were realized. So some of the applicable paradigms, and the one that sticks out and should carry through, is risk and risk management is a continuum. Our overall target is to safely achieve objectives while minimizing the impact to assets. As we discussed just a moment ago, it requires constant vigilance to detect changes and respond. But a caution statement: unintended consequences are being entertained in risk decision-making without a foundation that resides in the awareness and understanding as it relates to risk profiles, risk tolerance, risk appetite, and your risk capacity. And we gain understanding through risk assessment and business impact analysis. As I've said, every activity has a risk profile, and maintaining a state of normalcy for any asset is directly dependent upon the risk of that asset being disrupted. The key to managing risk is to fully understand the asset's risk profile. This profile focuses on three major factors. What must be protected? What must it be protected from? And what is currently available to protect it with? So what are some of the other aspects in risk decision making? As we progress in establishing the risk profile, we need to understand the backdrop which drives the risk control selection. These are depicted in the three circles on the slide. First is coordination. Is this a first-time evolution or is it routine? Is internal or external data available? Did we undertake consults and communications with subject matter experts, first responders, or local government? And as we move to location, is it public, private, historical? What's above it? What's below it? What's beside it? And then we come to timing. When must we make our determinations? And what events could accelerate it? These circumstances should drive the risk owner to select a course of action via analytical, intuitive, or a combination of both. So why? Well, as risk is never static, and each control has inherent strengths and weaknesses, the selection resides in the time, information, and experience of the decision maker. And so they may use an analytical aspect, and that is preemptive and proactive effort. And this gains an optimal solution using a methodical process for complex or unfamiliar circumstances. The upside of this is it compensates for inexperience. The downside is it requires time and can compound consequences when used where events are already in motion. On the intuitive side, this is a reactive effort applied where time and circumstances require rapid assessment and action. The upside is this provides an adequate versus optimal level of containment and damage control. The downside is this requires advanced levels of situational awareness based on knowledge, experience, and a perceptive judgment. These upsides and downsides can vary in how and to what degree each are applied. For example, analytical components may change due to cascading effects from an event, and this will drive us to develop contingency plans and make intuitive adjustments. So the more that things are interconnected, the more we risk applying intuitiveness. So that's a caution statement here. We can find this balance through planning, training, and exercises. So there's some universal watch areas as we deal with risk management, and they bring potential vulnerabilities. But there are, in an effort to address these potential vulnerabilities, we can look at a short-term means to conduct an entity-wide review of scope, purpose, and application of our risk management competencies through a risk management plan, and I recommend that. In the midterm, we can develop, train, and implement RMCs at all levels. And in the long term, we want to drive the organization culture to shift towards an awareness aspect. But the key to remember here is that everyone in the organization, regardless of where they sit, is a risk manager. Now, RMCs will not preclude all adverse events from occurring. However, they do enable efforts to focus on consequences likely to bring the greatest harm. They also employ approaches that are likely to mitigate vulnerability to threat exploitation. Staff, resources, brand, and reputation are bolstered and made more resilient by anticipating, communicating, and preparing for hazards via deliberate risk management. The value of risk management to decision makers is not in promoting a specific course of action, but in distinguishing the options available. Establishing this culture is critical to reliably achieving goals and objectives. Internal and external operating environments are the two key aspects that should be driving planning and response efforts. Placing this in a financial type context, every time we tolerate unacceptable risk behaviors or develop an appetite to risk in achieving an objective or goal, we write a risk check. So let's define these and identify indicators where we could be exceeding what's in our account. Risk tolerance we'll define as a level of uncertainty acceptable. And there are indicators that this is exceeded, and those include near misses being unaddressed, non-existent or ineffective plans and procedures, or your corrective actions are informal and non-programmatic. Defining risk appetite, well, these are assets risked to achieve the entity's goals and objectives. Indicators where we might have exceeded this include frequent unintended consequences, disruptions without planned responses, and limited to no training or exercise. The deposits to this account come from the inverse of these indicators, and these would be actions such as assessments, tracking operating experience, creating a lessons learned library or database, annually reviewing our plans, performing systematic training and drills and exercises, because these outcomes are used to measure the effectiveness towards our performance objectives. Risk capacity is insurance laws and policies and other data used to understand and manage our exposure, and it enables risk-based decisions. A little bit more on this later. While we're on internal risk environment, let's briefly discuss RMCs and the cyber risk. Tanium and NASDAQ recently teamed up to conduct a gap analysis of senior and executive leadership and a culture that appears to present with a risk management competencies deficit towards cybersecurity. The blue section in the chart on the left shows 80% are unable to interpret reports provided to inform decision making, with only 1 in 10, that is the orange section, vigilant in monitoring this portion of the risk profile. In looking at risk mitigation controls, approximately 90% infrequently update their controls to known threats, with only 10% operating at a consistent level. So thinking back to organizational perceptions and the slide where 10% viewed their organization effective, we notice a trend towards 10%. And given that PricewaterhouseCoopers Global State of Information Security Survey found losses per incident averaged $833,000, could this be a driver for risk management competencies? And on the topic of incidents, let's look at the external environment. So as we look at competencies, the potential for events to cause a massive negative impact on resources, providing significant life safety, economic, and environmental disruptions might be a significant driver for risk management competencies. And as it relates to risk-informed decisions, organizations are increasingly judged by sustainability. Stakeholders might ask what decisions were based on and what mitigations were in place prior to attempts to seize or forego an opportunity. And when we look at the ups and downs, how can we address these? Well, one method is a SWOT analysis, and that's attached to this presentation. This tool can serve all the way down to the tactical and individual level. And as we've known by looking at the news today, frequency and severity continues. We have terror in Africa and Europe and unrest in the Americas. So as we see here, megatrends are going to drive the foreseeable future. So what are megatrends? These are the developing, sustained, and macroeconomic forces impacting business, economy, society, cultures, and our personal lives, which define the future and drive the pace of change. Looking out over the coming years, while technological innovations provide various hardware and software to increase our productivity, there are unknown risks on the horizon. Some are offsetting ineffective mitigations by returning to old school, such as analog cameras. And in certain facets, some are returning to the use of typewriters. In response to the rise of China and the reemergence of Russia, the Snowden incident, and increases in ransomware, cybersecurity is holding new dominance on this stage. Now, as we look to globalization, this presents an opportunity for new relationships, but they can bring significant supply chain impacts. And with widespread instability, there's the potential for operational risk to organizations and their travelers as they move about. The demographic changes have led to surges into cities which strain critical infrastructure, and this creates health and safety concerns. However, this permits an environment for focused mass marketing and centralized manufacturing and sales. The key here is to understand that risk is never static. In regards to terror, Al-Qaeda is resurgent. They're taking advantage of conflicts between other terror groups, the civil unrest, and government mismanagement. One of the many tools being used to fund these efforts is terror-related kidnap for ransom, and we find this in places like Syria, Yemen, Libya, Cameroon, Kenya, and Somalia, as we'll see here in a moment in a limited case study. Notice how the data trends leading up to Paris, Brussels, and recent events in Turkey. For example, in 2014, the EU arrests rose from approximately 500 to 800 in 1 year, with attacks increasing from 150 to 200. As data from Brussels is still being processed and harmonized, let's take a look at the event and cascading effects in the Paris attacks. So as we look at the organizational preparation and response, some of the surveys came back with approximately 92% of the people that were in Paris felt they were there with no guidance. And back at the organizational headquarters, approximately half stood up their crisis management teams. And as they took the actions in the post-event environment, 33% canceled events and travels, but yet, amazingly, nobody reviewed their risk profile. So this impacts personnel. And so I'd ask you, who in your organization understands the plan, and who is trained in response for injury or death? Have you exercised this? How would you evacuate someone that's injured? And with your communications plans, has the no communications aspect been overlooked? And how are your people supplied if you don't have internal support where they are? And if you do have internal support, how are they positioned to aid? How are they stocked for first aid and hygiene? In regards to utilities, what's the procedure for communications if cell, internet are inoperable? Are they prepared, equipped, and trained to obtain drinking water? As they travel, where are your personnel? Are you sure? What are the procedures to be followed? Do they know it? Does your staff? Who monitors this? What are the indicators they are monitoring for? And what are the triggers for escalation and action? Now, leadership needs to focus on life safety in the initial aspects of the event. But once that's in hand, they need to immediately shift their focus to the cascading effects and risk consequences to the entity. So here's a limited case study on the Norwegian Refugee Council. And in 2012, they had an event which resulted in a lawsuit in 2015. In June 2012, a convoy was attacked in Kenya. In the attack, 5 staff members were shot, and one of the members unfortunately passed away. The 4 kidnapped, and then they were taken to Somalia. 4 days later, they were rescued. And in the after action, extreme security shortfalls were evident, as well as significant errors. There was limited accountability for those responsible in the shortages to safety and security at the time. And the court's verdict was gross negligence, although NRC, they only admitted to negligence in court. Now, to quote from the NRC's position, they've learned from this tragic event, and they'll continue to learn. They're continuously striving to improve risk management and staff care. The board stands by field managers in their difficult task in managing operational and security risks while ensuring a safe and secure environment. But let's look at one of the data resources available to both the aid worker and the NRC prior to that 2012 event. Now this is sourced from the aid worker security database. And this was the information that was available to both parties prior to the event's occurrence. How was the risk profile for Kenya determined, and what additional controls were considered when operating within the vicinity of the Somali border? Given approximately 10% of 2011 global aid worker victims were in Kenya, how was this factored? It appears as a missed opportunity resulting in grave consequences for the aid workers and the organization. And this drives our key takeaway, that missed opportunities can be devastating. So why is a risk culture unembraced? Well, KPMG, in a survey of corporate board members and internal auditors, said 58% of company employees had little or no understanding of how risk exposure should be assessed for likelihood and impact. 33% of these same respondents also said key leaders in their organization had no formal risk management training or guidance. More than ever, we need to understand how to make good decisions. Without training, there's no basis for critical thinking and judgment. And without a strong risk-aware culture, failure from poor decision-making is all but certain. Now, precepts are no substitute for independent thought or innovation in applying these principles and the concepts. Reading doctrine won't make you proficient at managing risks, nor will applying these or other aspects in the form of a checklist mentality. Rather, the information here is intended to shape how an entity thinks, considers risk, and applies it based on the environment. There's a compelling need to undertake a comparative analysis between these precepts and the organization and industry's experience. Think about who, what, when, where, why, and how. This all relates to ongoing and evolving situations in regard to, among other things, responsibility and ownership. So risk management should enhance overall decision-making and maximize the ability to achieve the entity's objectives. It should also be used to shape and control risk to achieve documented levels of risk tolerance. So let's look at some of the long-standing precepts in managing risk. Now this tool, understanding your span of control, areas of influence, and the environmental canvas, is used to measure the level of effort, influence, and the need for additional awareness prior to applying your limited resources. In optimizing this paradigm, we want to establish the context, understand our constraints and limitations, undertake coordination and communications, evaluate resources, weather, and the environment. And by the environment, I don't just mean the weather outside. It could also be the environment of people and just the culture that you're in. And then we want to manage our time wisely. And we do all this so that we understand ourselves, what might be adversarial to our efforts, and that we know the environment that we're going to operate in. Now we need to establish a baseline. The 3 bullets listed are key points to remember when setting this baseline or performing a review of our baseline. But when we determine risk, we want to remember there are 3 factors to consider. Threats, and threats require speculation of motivation, capabilities, and the anticipation of events yet to occur. But this is but one of the factors. Vulnerabilities are typically within your span of control, and vulnerabilities can be analyzed, tested, and exercised to ensure the mitigations we've applied are effective and our resources are available in order to leverage that. Consequences is characterized by the impact to the asset. Should mitigations fail, and more often than not, these require an external resource. So it's important to identify threats, but that's of little value if you don't understand the vulnerabilities and consequences that threat might try to exploit. Now, in managing the risk profile, establishing documented plans, policies, and procedures will go far in maintaining a collaborative effort. But these are the 3 steps that we want to take prior to any campaign. And that is, we need to understand the collective risk profile. And how do we go about that? Well, we want to define what could happen. That's the threats and hazards. We want to characterize our vulnerabilities and the likelihood of that undesirable event occurring. And then we want to characterize the severity of the consequences should it present itself. Then from there we want to select the appropriate mitigations. Using a holistic approach, we want to invite stakeholders and subject matter experts, and then we want to listen to their feedback and integrate that into the process. And lastly, we undertake our operational planning. We want to remember back to that first slide where effectiveness can change rapidly for our mitigations. And so this requires a diligent monitoring capability of the climate and culture during the entire operation. Now, from a strategic aspect, we have the risk needs assessment. And a risk needs assessment provides a snapshot of where the risk lies within the entity, and it analyzes relative risk to your assets. This tool can be used to update your current risk profile, and it aids in strategic and larger operational decision making. And this takes us well through establishing our future plans regardless of the entity that wants to implement this. Now from the operational level, and this also is a tool that's downloadable with this webinar, we can see that there's commonality of risk across the entity, but each leader needs to maintain a risk register for their department, program, or project. And this provides benefit not only to just whatever that activity is, but it provides a return on investment by reinforcing your core business attributes. And it's tangible. We can audit this. We can look at how we're moving forward and how it relates to the outcomes that the entity experiences in their activity. At the tactical and individual level, we can adopt the SWOT analysis. And while variable across the spectrum, this example demonstrates how SWOT can be used even at the individual decision-making level. As we look at the strengths, we tend to overlook the weaknesses. And as we seek opportunities, sometimes we want to table the risk concerns from the threats and hazards as we drive forward, seeking to reap those opportunities for whatever aligns with our goals and objectives. So where does your organization reside in all of this? So as we look back, tolerance is the degree to which risk is accepted. In your organization, what near misses are being left unaddressed? What non-existent or ineffective plans remain? And are your corrective actions still informal? As we look at risk appetite, these are the assets we risk to achieve goals and objectives. Do you have frequent unintended consequences? Is your organizational disruptions without planned responses? And in building capacity, that is data used to understand and manage exposure and make risk-based decisions, how much risk can your organization absorb? Let's place this into context. How does risk inform your strategy? What's been done to increase your risk capacity? Too many decisions are made with an incomplete understanding of risk. In the face of increasing frequency and severity of terror and unrest for the foreseeable future, I encourage you to develop the capacity to manage them and apply this last key takeaway. And that is, although people learn from history, they rarely undertake the corrective actions that's revealed from it. Erica?
All right, Mike, thank you. It was excellent. I'm going to swap out with you. All right. So if anybody has questions at this time, I know we've covered a good bit of information. You can put those into the chat box on your right-hand side of your GoToWebinar control panel. And while we're waiting on some questions that may trickle in, I will take this opportunity to let you know that we have some upcoming webinars. This webinar is part of a monthly webinar series that we do here at iJet. And our next two are Gaining Buy-in from the C-Suite to Build a Holistic TRM Program on May 25th, as well as Just the Right Time, Just the Right Information, Mass Communications, Mobile Technology, and Global Hotlines on June 22nd. So you guys can check those out on ijet.com to see those and additional upcoming topics. Looks like everyone absorbed the information today, Mike. Looks like we don't have any questions for you on the live broadcast, but I'm sure we'll probably have some follow-up questions via email afterwards that we can pass to you, and you can either send those to us directly right here at response@ijet.com if you would like. Be sure to take the brief survey that will pop up at the end of this webinar when you hop off, and thank you everyone for attending today. Thank you, Mike, for your time today.
Thank you, Erica.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.